Before we dive into this story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's begin. The church was never supposed to be part of his Sunday. Thomas Hale had planned to spend the afternoon the way he spent most of his days off. Quietly, alone, with a cup of coffee, and the kind of silence that doesn't ask anything of you. 20 years on the Millhaven police force had taught him to appreciate silence. Most people never learned how loud the world really was until they'd spent 2 decades answering its worst calls. But the radio had other plans. The call came in at 1:47 p.m. Welfare check. Millhaven Community Church. 2 children, unaccompanied. No guardian on site. He almost let someone else take it. Almost. The church parking lot was empty when he arrived. Just one old sedan with a cracked taillight sitting crooked near the side entrance. Inside, the afternoon light came through the stained glass windows in long stripes of gold and blue, painting the wooden pews in colors that had no business being that beautiful on a day like this. He found them in the 3rd row from the back. 2 girls. The younger one, small for her age, sat with her hands folded in her lap. Not the way children fold their hands in church, but tighter, the way someone holds on when they're trying very hard not to let go. The older one sat straight, chin up, eyes fixed on the floor ahead of her like she was solving a problem no one else could see. Thomas stopped at the end of the pew. "Hey there," he said, keeping his voice low. "My name is Thomas. I'm going to sit here for a minute, if that's okay." Neither girl spoke. But the younger one, Lily, he would learn, glanced up at him with eyes that were too tired for 8 years old. The older one, Harper, 11, didn't move at all. He sat. He didn't rush. His radio crackled softly and he turned the volume down without thinking about it. Outside, a car passed. A bird landed on the windowsill and left again. The silence inside that church was the kind that holds things. Old prayers, old sorrows, and something new that hadn't found its shape yet. His phone buzzed. Brenda Solis, the county social worker, on call. He stepped just outside the pew, close enough to watch the girls, and answered. "Thomas." Brenda's voice was careful. "I can be there in 20 minutes. If I come, I have to take them. There's no grandmother on site, no authorized adult, and the father—" She paused. "He's not reachable." Thomas looked through the open door at the 2 girls. Lily had gone back to staring at her hands. Harper had turned, just slightly, and was watching him. "What happens if you take them?" he asked. Brenda didn't answer right away. That told him everything. "Give me 24 hours, he said. "Thomas, 24 hours, Brenda." A long pause. "I'll make a note," she said finally. "But this becomes your name on the report." He put the phone in his pocket and walked back inside. Harper was still watching him. "Is our grandmother okay?" she asked. Her voice was steady, steadier than it had any right to be. "She's being taken care of," Thomas said. And that, at least, was true. He sat back down. Lily leaned, just slightly, just barely, in his direction. Not enough to touch. Just enough to not be alone. Thomas Hale had spent 20 years believing that doing his job meant knowing when to step back, follow the procedure, file the report, let the system do what the system was built to do. But sitting in that quiet church with the light coming through the colored glass and 2 little girls holding on to the only thing they had left, which was, at that moment, nothing but each other, something shifted in him. Not loudly, not with any kind of fanfare. Just quietly, the way the most important things always begin. He didn't know yet what the next weeks would cost him. He didn't know about the phone calls, the paperwork, the professional risks, or the conversations with his daughter that were long overdue. He didn't know how much a person could carry before they had to choose, really choose, what mattered most. All he knew was that he wasn't leaving that church without those girls. And that when Harper looked at him, really looked at him, he saw something he hadn't seen in a very long time. Someone deciding whether or not to trust. He intended to be worth it. What would you have done in his place? Leave a comment below, and stay with us, because this story is only just beginning. The drive to Clover Street took less than 10 minutes. Nobody spoke. Lily sat behind him in the patrol car, her small backpack on her lap, both arms wrapped around it like it was the most important thing in the world. Harper sat beside her, upright, watching the town pass through the window with the focused expression of someone making mental notes. Thomas had offered to call someone, a neighbor, a family friend, anyone. Harper had shaken her head. There isn't really anyone. she said, not with sadness, just as a fact. That was the moment Thomas understood that this family had been quietly running on empty for a long time, and that nobody outside had noticed, or perhaps nobody had allowed themselves to. The house on Clover Street was a small white cape with green shutters, the kind of home that had clearly been loved once and was still being held together by sheer determination. The front porch had a loose board. One of the shutters leaned slightly to the left, but the steps had been swept, and there were 2 clay pots by the door, empty now, waiting for spring. Harper unlocked the front door without hesitation. She knew exactly which key, exactly how much to lift the handle. Thomas stepped inside. It wasn't chaos. It was something quieter than that, and in some ways harder to look at. The living room was tidy. A folded blanket sat on the armchair by the window, positioned just right for someone who spent long hours sitting there. The kitchen table had 3 placemats, neatly arranged, but the refrigerator, when Thomas opened it carefully, held very little. Some butter, a few eggs, half a carton of milk. On the counter sat 4 prescription bottles. He didn't touch them. He just looked and counted the remaining pills without picking anything up. Lily had gone straight to the small couch and tucked herself into the corner of it, still holding her backpack. She hadn't taken off her coat. Harper moved through the kitchen the way someone moves through a space they know by heart, opening a cabinet, finding a sleeve of crackers, setting them on the table in front of her sister without being asked. She eats when she's nervous, Harper said without looking at Thomas. Smart system, he said. Harper glanced at him, just briefly, and something in her expression shifted. Not warmth, not yet, but a small reduction in guardedness. A door not opened, but unlocked. Thomas found the thermostat in the hallway. The heat had dropped to 61 degrees. He adjusted it, listened for the system to kick on, and heard only a weak mechanical cough before it steadied. Not great, but enough. He ordered pizza from the place on Millhaven's Main Street. When it arrived, the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table. Thomas in Margaret's chair, he realized too late, and then chose not to move so the girls wouldn't feel the weight of that detail. Lily ate carefully, folding her napkin between bites. Harper ate slowly, watching Thomas with those measuring eyes. "Do you have kids?" she asked. "A daughter," he said. "She's grown now. Lives in Richmond. Do you see her a lot?" He paused just a moment too long. "Not as much as I should," he said. Harper nodded as if that confirmed something she'd already suspected about adults. After dinner, Thomas washed the plates. He found a notepad on the counter and wrote down his personal cell number, his station number, and his name in clear block letters. He set it beside the prescription bottles where it would be seen first thing in the morning. He stood at the door for a moment before leaving, looking back at the 2 girls on the couch. Lily, now asleep, tipped sideways, still in her coat. Harper reading or pretending to. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. Harper didn't look up. "People say that," she replied. He didn't argue. He just nodded once and stepped out into the cold night. In his car, he sat for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Nora. It rang 4 times before she picked up, her voice slightly guarded the way it always was when she saw his name. "Dad? Hey, sweetheart." He cleared his throat. I wanted to hear your voice." A pause. "Is everything okay?" He looked up at the lit window of the house on Clover Street, where a small shadow moved behind the curtain. Harper, checking that he'd actually left, or perhaps checking that he was still there. "I'm not sure yet," he said honestly. He drove home slowly. Something had followed him out of that house. Not a problem, not a case number, not a report to be filed. Something that felt, quietly and uncomfortably, like the beginning of a responsibility he hadn't asked for, and wasn't going to walk away from. Millhaven General was the kind of small hospital where everybody knew somebody on staff, and news traveled faster through the hallways than through any official channel. Thomas had barely shown his badge at the front desk before the nurse on duty, a stout woman named Carol, who had known him since his first year on the force, leaned over the counter and said quietly, "She's been asking about the girls since she woke up. Hasn't asked about herself once." Room 14 was at the end of a short corridor, past a window that looked out onto the hospital's bare winter garden. Thomas knocked twice and pushed the door open slowly. Margaret Calloway was sitting up in bed. She was smaller than he remembered, or maybe the hospital gown and the white pillow behind her just made her look that way. Her silver hair had been brushed to one side, and she held her hands folded on top of the blanket, with the careful dignity of a woman who refused to be reduced to her circumstances, no matter where she found herself. When she saw Thomas, her first expression was not relief, it was embarrassment. "Tom," she said, and immediately waved one hand as if she could redirect the entire visit. "You didn't have to come all the way out here. I'm perfectly fine. It was just a little episode." "Good morning, Margaret," he said, and sat down in the chair beside her bed without being invited. She pressed her lips together, but she didn't ask him to leave. For a moment, neither of them spoke. A monitor beeped softly. Down the hall, someone laughed. One of the nurses, probably. The ordinary sounds of a place that had seen too much to be dramatic about any of it. "The girls are all right," Thomas said. "They slept at home. I checked on the house." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, some of the tension had left her shoulders. "Harper," she said. "She didn't cry, did she?" "No," he said. "She made sure Lily ate." Margaret nodded slowly, the way people nod when they hear something that makes them proud and breaks their heart at the same time. "She's been doing that since she was 9, she said softly. "Taking care of things. I kept telling her she didn't have to, but she's like her grandfather was." She paused. "Some people just can't help carrying things." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "Margaret, the medication bottles on your counter, some of them were nearly empty. The refill dates were weeks ago." She looked toward the window. "The pharmacy charges more than the insurance covers now," she said, her voice even, almost casual. "I was managing. By cutting your doses?" A long pause. "By being careful," she said. Thomas didn't push. He'd been a police officer long enough to know that some admissions needed space to arrive on their own. Then, quietly, Margaret said something that he wasn't expecting. "I didn't want the girls learning too early that the world doesn't come when you call." The words landed in the room and stayed there. Thomas looked at her. This woman who had been quietly holding everything together with both hands while her hands shook, who had hidden her own needs so completely that by the time anyone noticed, she was lying on a hospital floor. "They already know you love them," he said. That part came through. Her chin lifted just slightly. "I'm not looking for reassurance, Tom." "I know," he said. "I'm not offering any." That seemed to satisfy her more than anything gentle might have. They talked for another 20 minutes, about the girls' school schedules, about a neighbor who sometimes helped with groceries, about Daniel, whose name Margaret said the way you say the name of someone you've prayed for so long the prayer has become its own kind of silence. "He's trying," she said. "I know," Thomas said. "You don't believe it." "I believe you believe it," he said carefully. "That counts for something." When he stood to leave, Margaret reached out and touched his arm. Just briefly, just enough. "Don't let them be separated, Tom," she said, not pleading, stating. He looked at her hand on his sleeve, then at her face. "I'm working on it," he said. He meant it. But walking back down that corridor, passing the bare winter garden, he also knew that meaning something and being able to deliver on it were two entirely different promises, and he had just made one he wasn't sure he could keep. By the 4th day, Thomas had a system. He finished his shift, stopped at Grady's Market on the way, and arrived at Clover Street before 5. He never knocked loudly. He always brought something practical. Milk, bread, soup, the kind of groceries that didn't call attention to themselves, but filled the spaces that had been empty. Harper always unlocked the door before he finished knocking. He wasn't sure if that meant she'd been watching for him, or simply that she heard everything. With Harper, both were equally possible. The house was warmer now. Thomas had called a friend who did heating work and asked him to take a look, off the books, as a favor. The system wasn't perfect, but it no longer coughed when it ran. Lily had noticed immediately and announced with great seriousness that the house felt like a hug now. Harper had said nothing, but she'd stopped wearing her coat indoors. That was progress. One afternoon, Thomas arrived to find Harper alone at the kitchen table, a composition notebook open in front of her, a pencil moving carefully down the page. Lily was at a neighbor's house for a school project. The house was unusually quiet. Thomas set the groceries down and glanced at the notebook without meaning to. It wasn't homework. It was a list. Several lists, actually, written in small, precise handwriting. Grocery prices with store names beside them. School pickup times. A medication schedule with check boxes, most of them filled in. A column of numbers that, When Thomas looked closer, appeared to be a weekly budget. Harper closed the notebook. Not quickly, not defensively, just firmly. "You don't have to do that alone, you know," Thomas said. "I know," she said. And then after a pause, "But I'm good at it." He didn't argue. He sat down across from her instead. "What's your favorite subject?" he asked. She looked at him like the question was slightly beneath her. Then she answered anyway. "Math." "Why math?" She considered this seriously, the way she considered most things. "Because it always has a right answer," she said. "You just have to find it. It doesn't change depending on who's looking." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's a good reason," he said. Something in Harper's posture shifted, barely, almost invisibly, but he caught it, the slight release of a shoulder. The pencil set down instead of held. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, which was its own kind of milestone. Then his phone rang. It was Nora. He stepped into the hallway and answered, keeping his voice low. "Dad," she said, "I looked up the county foster system in your area. Did you know siblings get separated more often than not when placements are emergency-based?" "I know," he said. "And you're still going over there every day?" "Yes." A pause. "Dad, you can't save every broken family in Millhaven." The words were careful, kind even, but they landed with weight. "Maybe not," he said quietly, "but I can show up for this one." Nora didn't respond right away. He could hear her breathing, that particular silence she'd had since childhood when she was deciding whether to push further or let something rest. She let it rest. After he hung up, Thomas stood in the hallway for a moment. Through the kitchen doorway, he could see Harper had opened her notebook again and was writing something new at the bottom of a page. He didn't ask what it was, but the next morning, Captain Briggs called him into the office before his shift began. The door closed. The conversation was brief and professional and uncomfortable in the way that only conversations between people who respect each other can be. "There's a note in your file, Thomas. Conflict of interest review. Informal, for now." Briggs leaned back in his chair. "The promotion board meets in 6 weeks. I want you to understand what I'm telling you." Thomas understood perfectly. He thanked Briggs. He walked out. He drove to Clover Street after his shift. Harper unlocked the door before he finished knocking. He stepped inside. Some things, it turned out, were more important than a promotion. He was only beginning to understand how many. Millhaven was the kind of town where kindness and judgment often arrived in the same sentence. By the second week, people knew. Not the details. People rarely needed details in a town this size. They knew that Margaret Calloway was in the hospital, that the girls were at home on Clover Street, and that Thomas Hale had been stopping by every evening with groceries and a quiet determination that some people found admirable and others found puzzling. The church organized a prayer chain. 3 casseroles appeared on the porch in 2 days. A card was taped to the front door, signed by 12 names Thomas didn't recognize. It looked like community. It felt, up close, like something more complicated. On Sunday, Thomas stopped by the church to pick up a box of supplies the pastor had set aside for the girls. He arrived during the tail end of the morning service and waited in the back. From where he stood, he could see the front pew where Margaret always sat, empty now, her folded bulletin still tucked into the hymnal slot. A woman in a pressed blue coat leaned toward the pastor after the closing prayer. Her voice was low but carried the particular confidence of someone accustomed to being overheard. "Sometimes," she said, smoothing her gloves, "God closes doors for a reason." She wasn't being cruel. That was almost the harder part. She believed what she was saying. And 2 people nearby nodded gently, the way people nod when something confirms what they'd already privately decided. Thomas picked up the box and left without a word. In the car, he sat for a moment. Then he drove to Clover Street. The professional pressure arrived quietly, the way it always did in small departments. His colleague Ray Dunham caught up with him in the parking lot after a Tuesday shift, falling into step beside him with the practiced casualness of someone who had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "You know people are talking," Ray said. "People always talk," Thomas said. "Briggs is getting questions from the county liaison." Ray paused. "Someone filed a formal inquiry, wants to know if there's an undisclosed personal relationship with the family." Thomas stopped walking. "There isn't," he said. "I know that," Ray said. "But Thomas," he lowered his voice, "there's a word going around the break room. They're saying you're going soft. Thomas looked at his old partner for a long moment. Let them talk, he said. Ray nodded slowly. He didn't look entirely convinced, but he didn't argue either. At school that week, Lily told her teacher that Officer Thomas had shown her how to check if the heat was working by holding her hand near the vent. She said it the way children say things, openly, proudly, without any awareness of how it might sound in a report. The teacher made a note. The note reached the principal. The principal called Brenda Solis. Brenda called Thomas. I'm not saying you've done anything wrong, she said, her voice careful and professional. But I need you to understand that this is becoming a documented situation. Your involvement is on record now. That means it's reviewable. I understand, Thomas said. Do you? She asked, not unkindly, genuinely. He thought about the prescription bottles, about Harper's lists, about Lily asleep on the couch still wearing her coat. Yes, he said, I do. That same evening across town, a man sat in a folding chair in the basement of a building Thomas had driven past 100 times without thinking about it. The room smelled like old coffee and floor wax. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A circle of chairs held a circle of people, each one carrying something heavy and private. When it was his turn, the man looked at the floor first. Then he raised his eyes. He said his name, Daniel, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the room didn't echo it back with disappointment. It just held it. That, too, was a beginning. Margaret came home on a Thursday. Thomas drove her himself. She sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed forward, watching Millhaven pass outside the window with the expression of someone returning from a place they hadn't expected to leave from. She didn't say much on the drive, but when they turned onto Clover Street and she saw the house, the swept porch, the repaired shutter, the small light on above the front door, she pressed her lips together in a way that had nothing to do with displeasure. Lily burst through the front door before the car had fully stopped. She crossed the porch in 3 steps and wrapped both arms around her grandmother's waist before Margaret had finished standing up. Margaret held her with the kind of grip that doesn't perform anything, that simply holds. Harper stood in the doorway. She didn't run. She waited. When Margaret finally walked up the steps, Harper stepped forward and took her grandmother's bag without being asked. She held the door. She guided her, without touching her, to the good chair by the window, the one with the folded blanket. I made soup, Harper said simply. Margaret looked at her granddaughter for a long moment. Of course you did, she said softly. Thomas carried in the discharge paperwork and the updated medication schedule from the county nurse program he'd quietly enrolled Margaret in the week before. He set it on the counter, organized by day. He didn't make a production of it. Margaret noticed anyway. Tom, she said from her chair, you didn't have to do all this. I know, he said. She studied him the way she'd been studying him since he was a young officer making his first rounds in Millhaven, with the particular attention of a woman who had learned to distinguish between people who meant well and people who followed through. She didn't say anything else, but she nodded once. That was Margaret's version of thank you. He'd learned to receive it. The weeks that followed settled into a fragile but functioning rhythm. Thomas finished his shifts and came by most evenings. He brought groceries. He fixed small things, a cabinet hinge, a leaking faucet, a garden light that had stopped working. He helped Lily with a book report on elephants, which she delivered with considerable authority at the kitchen table while Harper corrected her spelling without being asked. He was careful. He never overstepped. He sat at the table, not at the head of it. He asked before he touched anything that wasn't his to touch. But the lines were blurring, slowly, naturally, in the way that lines blur when people share meals and small tasks, and the ordinary hours of ordinary days. One evening Lily reached for his hand crossing the street, automatically the way children reach for the hand of whoever is beside them, and he took it without thinking. Later, sitting in his car outside his apartment building, he sat with that for a long time. He hadn't been somebody's steady presence in years, not since Nora was small, and even then, if he was honest, he'd been more badge than father, more schedule than person. The steering wheel was cold under his hands. His phone buzzed. Brenda Solis. Thomas, the 30-day window is closing. I need a formal placement plan on file by the end of next week. If there's no confirmed arrangement, I have to move forward with county options. He closed his eyes briefly. I hear you, he said. I know you do, she said. I also know what you've been doing over there. And I want you to know, off the record, that it matters. What you're doing matters. A pause. But the paperwork has to match the reality, Thomas. That's how we protect them. He thanked her and hung up. Upstairs in his apartment, he sat at his kitchen table. His own table, sparse and quiet, nothing like the one on Clover Street, and opened his laptop. He stared at the screen for a long time. Then he began to type. Not a report. Not yet. Just his thoughts laid out in plain words about 2 girls and a woman with empty pill bottles and a repaired shutter and soup always ready when it was needed. About what it meant to show up. About what it cost not to. He wrote until the apartment got cold. Then he closed the laptop, went to the window and looked out at the dark street below. Quiet, familiar, unchanged. He had 30 days, and for the first time in a long time, he intended to use every one of them. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning. Harper found it first, tucked between an electric bill and a circular from the pharmacy, handwritten on plain white paper, the envelope slightly creased as if it had been held many times before being sent. She recognized the handwriting immediately. She stood at the mailbox for a long moment before bringing it inside. She set it on the kitchen table in front of Margaret without a word. Margaret looked at the envelope, then at Harper. Then she put on her reading glasses, opened it carefully, and read it twice without speaking. When she finished, she folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands. He's in a program, she said quietly. 2 hours from here. He says he's sorry. Lily looked up from her cereal. Is Daddy coming home? She asked. The kitchen was very still. Not yet, sweetheart, Margaret said, but he's working on it. Lily accepted this with the particular faith of a child who has learned to hold hope loosely, carefully, like something fragile, without squeezing too hard. Harper said nothing. She picked up her backpack and went to school. That afternoon, Thomas stopped by and Margaret showed him the letter, with a quiet nod that meant she trusted him with it. He read it standing at the counter, slowly, giving each line its proper weight. The handwriting was uneven in places, not from carelessness but from effort. The kind of effort that shows in a person's pen when they're choosing every word deliberately, because they know they've used words carelessly before. Daniel wrote that he wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't making promises he couldn't keep. He just needed them to know he was alive, and that he thought about the girls every single day. Thomas set the letter down. He felt something he hadn't expected. Not anger, not the professional skepticism he'd carried through 20 years of similar situations. Something more complicated. Something that recognized the cost of writing a letter like that. The particular courage it takes to reach toward people you've let down, without knowing if they'll reach back. What do you think? Margaret asked. I think he means it, Thomas said carefully. Right now, in this moment, he means every word. But, no but, he said, meaning it is where it starts. That's not nothing. Margaret looked at him over her glasses. You're more generous than I expected, she said. I've seen what it looks like when a person stops trying, he said. This doesn't look like that. That evening the house was quieter than usual. Lily drew at the table. Her drawings had recently begun, including a figure Thomas recognized as himself, standing beside a house with a fixed shutter. He never mentioned it. Harper sat across from him doing homework, or appearing to. Her pencil moved, but slowly. Thomas was about to say goodnight when he noticed it. Harper's shoulders, always straight, always composed, had dropped slightly. Her face was turned just enough toward the window that the light caught the edge of something she hadn't meant to show. He didn't say anything. He didn't move. He simply stayed. After a few minutes, without turning her face, Harper said very quietly, "What if he tries and it still doesn't work?" Thomas considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Then he tries again," he said. "And in the meantime, the people who are here, stay here." Harper was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned back to her homework. Thomas put a glass of water on the table beside her, quietly, without ceremony, and stayed until Lily had gone to bed and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds. He drove home slowly. On his phone were 2 missed calls from Nora. He called her back from the parking lot of his building, engine still running. "Dad," she said, "how are you actually doing?" He leaned his head back against the seat. "I'm tired," he said honestly. "But it's a different kind of tired than I'm used to." Different how? He thought about it. It feels like it's going somewhere, he said. Nora was quiet on the other end. Not the careful quiet of someone choosing words. The softer quiet of someone who had just heard something that surprised them. "Get some sleep, Dad," she said finally. And then before she hung up, "I'm glad you called back." So was he. She called ahead this time. That was new. Nora had driven up from Richmond twice in the past year. Once for Thomas's department anniversary dinner, which he'd forgotten to mention until 2 days before, and once to help him sort through boxes from his old house after the lease ended. Both visits had been practical, organized, completed efficiently and without much lingering. This time she called 3 days early and said she was bringing the bookshelf he'd been asking about for months. Thomas knew the bookshelf was an excuse. He didn't say so. She arrived on a Saturday afternoon, her car packed with the bookshelf broken into pieces in the back and a casserole dish on the passenger seat that she carried up the porch steps of Clover Street as if she'd been coming here for years. Thomas had told her they were having dinner at Margaret's. He hadn't told her it would feel like anything more than that. The kitchen on Clover Street was warm and smelled like roasted chicken. Harper had set the table. 4 places, perfectly arranged, forks exactly where they belonged. Lily had drawn a small welcome card that she'd taped to the back of Nora's chair, which Nora discovered mid-sentence and stopped talking entirely for a moment. "I made it this morning," Lily announced. "I used the good markers." "It's beautiful," Nora said, and she meant it. Dinner was simple. Chicken, green beans with a little lemon the way Margaret always made them. Bread from the bakery on 5th that Thomas had picked up on his way over. Margaret sat at the head of the table, more rested than she'd looked in weeks. She asked Nora questions, real ones, the kind that required actual answers. About her work, her apartment, what Richmond was like in winter. Nora answered carefully at first, then less carefully. Thomas watched his daughter across the table. He noticed the moment she stopped being politely present and became genuinely interested. It happened somewhere between Margaret's story about the winter of 1987 and Harper's quiet, unprompted correction of a date that turned out to be exactly right. "She fact-checks everything," Lily said proudly, gesturing at her sister. "Someone has to," Harper said. Nora laughed, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded. Thomas couldn't remember the last time he'd heard that. After dinner, after the girls had cleared the table and Margaret had settled into her chair with her evening medication and a book, Thomas and Nora stood on the front porch in the cold. She had her coat buttoned to the top. He had his hands in his pockets. The street was quiet the way Millhaven got quiet on Saturday nights. Not empty, just settled. "You're already attached," Nora said. Not accusatory, observational. "I know," he said. "To all of them, not just the girls." He didn't deny it. "Is that a problem?" he asked. She looked out at the street for a moment. "I used to think you didn't know how to be attached," she said quietly, "that it wasn't something you were capable of, that the job had just used it all up." Thomas was still. "Nora, I'm not saying it to hurt you," she said. "I'm saying it because—" She paused. "You're different here. In that kitchen. With those girls." She turned to look at him. "You laughed differently." He didn't know what to say to that. "I missed a lot," he said finally. "With you, I know that." "You did," she said, simply, without drama. "But Dad," she pulled her coat tighter, "you're here now. That's not nothing." They stood in the cold for a while longer, talking in the way they hadn't talked in years, without agenda, without old grievances pulling at the edges, just 2 people finding their way back to each other through honest words and cold air. When Nora finally walked to her car, she paused with her hand on the door. "Those girls are lucky," she said, "even if they don't know it yet." "Harper knows," Thomas said. Nora smiled. Small, private, real. "Yeah," she said. "I think she does." She drove away slowly. Thomas stood on the porch until her taillights disappeared around the corner. Then he looked up at the lit window where a small shadow moved behind the curtain. Something between them had shifted tonight. Not fixed. Not finished, but moved in the right direction after a very long time of standing still. Patricia Wynne arrived on a Tuesday. She drove a gray sedan, carried a brown leather folder, and wore the expression of someone who had learned long ago not to form opinions before she had all the information. She was somewhere in her 50s, with close-cropped hair and reading glasses that she took on and off with practiced efficiency. She'd been a family advocate for the county for 18 years. Thomas had looked her up. Her record was careful, thorough, and fair. She didn't lean toward removal, and she didn't lean toward keeping families together. She leaned toward what was actually best for the children in front of her. That was, Thomas had decided, the most he could ask for. He met her at the house on Clover Street before her visit and said very little. He'd learned that saying too much before a review did more harm than good. He introduced her to Margaret, who received her with quiet dignity from the good chair by the window, back straight, hands folded. Then Patricia asked to speak with the girls separately. She spoke with Lily first in the kitchen, while Thomas and Margaret waited in the living room. From where he sat, Thomas could hear Lily's voice, bright, earnest, occasionally going off on tangents about her elephant book report, but not the specific words. Whatever Patricia asked, Lily answered the way Lily answered everything, openly, completely, without artifice. Then she spoke with Harper. That conversation was quieter. Thomas watched the closed kitchen door and said nothing. When Patricia came back into the living room, her expression hadn't changed. She sat across from Margaret, opened her folder and asked her questions about the medication schedule, the county nurse visits, the support structure, the financial situation, with the calm efficiency of someone assembling a picture one piece at a time. Margaret answered everything directly. She didn't minimize and she didn't exaggerate. When Patricia asked about Daniel, Margaret said, "He's in recovery. He wrote to us. I believe he's trying." She said it the way she said most things, as a fact she had decided to stand behind. Patricia wrote it down. When she was finished, she closed her folder and looked at Margaret over her glasses. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "Harper told me something during our conversation that I want you to know," she said. Margaret waited. She said, and I'm going to quote her directly. Patricia glanced at her notes. "My grandmother loves us. She just got sick. That's not the same as not caring." The room was very quiet. Margaret looked down at her folded hands. She didn't speak for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were steady, but something behind them had shifted. Some carefully maintained composure, loosened just enough to show what was underneath. "She's right," Margaret said. "That's exactly right." Patricia's recommendation came through 3 days later. A 60-day supervised extension. The girls would remain with Margaret. Weekly check-ins from the county nurse. A secondary support figure required to be formally documented and available. Thomas's name was on the form. Brenda called him to confirm. "You understand what signing this means," she said. Not a question. "Yes," he said. "It's not adoption. It's not guardianship. But it puts you on record as a responsible adult presence. If something changes, if Margaret's health changes, you're the first call." "I understand," he said. "Thomas." She paused. "Are you sure?" He thought about Patricia's folder, about Harper's words repeated in that quiet living room, about the way Margaret had looked down at her hands. "Yes," he said. "I'm sure." He drove to the county office that afternoon and signed the form at the front desk. The woman behind the counter stamped it, made a copy, and slid it across without ceremony. He folded his copy and put it in his jacket pocket. He drove home slowly, the way he'd been driving most things lately, without rushing, paying attention, noticing what was there. He sat in his apartment that evening in the particular quiet of a man who has just made something real that began as instinct. He wasn't afraid exactly. He was something else, something that sat closer to purpose than he'd felt in a long time. He made himself a cup of coffee, sat at his sparse kitchen table, and thought about what came next. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time he felt like he knew which direction he was walking. Nobody warns you about the accumulation, not the big things, those you can prepare for, brace against, survive. It's the small things, stacked quietly one on top of another over days and weeks, that eventually make a person feel the full weight of what they've taken on. Thomas had always been good at carrying things alone. 20 years on the force had made him efficient at it. You compartmentalize. You finish the shift. You go home, you sleep, you come back. You don't let one thing bleed into the next. But this was different. This didn't end at shift change. It started with small failures. He forgot a dinner he'd promised Nora. A simple thing. Just the two of them at a restaurant in town, something they'd planned 2 weeks in advance. He remembered at 7:30 when she called, her voice carefully neutral in the way it got when she was choosing not to be heard out loud. He apologized. She said it was fine. It wasn't fine. and they both knew it. 3 days later, he arrived late to Margaret's weekly check-in visit. The county nurse had already come and gone, and Harper had handled everything alone, answering questions, showing the medication chart, signing the visitor log in her small, precise handwriting. When Thomas walked in, Harper looked up at him with an expression that wasn't accusatory. That was almost worse. She simply said, "It went okay," and went back to her homework. The evening that tested him most arrived without announcement, the way those evenings always do. He'd had a long shift, a complicated afternoon call that had required 3 hours of paperwork. He arrived at Clover Street later than usual, tired in a way that sat behind his eyes, and found the kitchen in mild chaos. Lily had knocked over a full glass of juice that had spread across the only set of county paperwork Thomas hadn't yet copied, and she was crying quietly at the table while Harper tried to blot it with a dish towel. Thomas looked at the paperwork, at the spreading stain, at 2 weeks of careful documentation soaking into the kitchen table. He felt something rise in him, sharp, sudden, the particular frustration of a person who is already full and has just been asked to hold one more thing. He stepped outside. He stood on the back porch in the cold for 90 seconds. He breathed. Then he went back inside, found the paper towels, and said, "It's all right, Lily. We'll rewrite what we need to. It's just paper." Lily wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thomas," she said. "Don't be," he said. "Accidents happen to everyone." Harper watched him from across the table. She didn't say anything, but something in her expression shifted. Something that looked quietly like relief, like she had been waiting to see what he would do when things got hard. He had passed some test he hadn't known he was taking. Ray Dunham took him fishing on a Saturday morning. No agenda, no radio, just the reservoir outside town, 2 folding chairs, and the particular silence of old friends who don't need to fill every moment with words. They sat for a long time without speaking. Then Ray said, eyes on the water, "You ever think maybe this is the thing you were always supposed to do, and the badge was just how you got here?" Thomas didn't answer right away. A bird crossed the water low and fast and disappeared into the tree line. "I think about it," Thomas said finally. Ray nodded, recast his line. "You look different," Ray said. "Tired, but different." "Different how?" Ray thought about it. "Like you're somewhere," he said, "instead of just passing through." Thomas looked at the water. He didn't have an answer for that. But the question didn't leave him. It rode home with him in the truck, sat with him through the afternoon, and was still there that evening when he walked to his car and found something tucked under the windshield wiper. A drawing. Crayon on notebook paper, slightly uneven at the edges. A house with a yellow door. 4 figures standing in front of it, carefully labeled in handwriting he recognized as Lily's. Grandma, Harper, Lily, Mr. Thomas. He stood in the parking lot for a long time, the drawing in both hands. Then he got in the car, set it carefully on the passenger seat, and drove. Not home, but back toward Clover Street, back toward the lit window and the sound of someone inside who was glad he came. Daniel Calloway called on a Thursday morning. Not the house, Thomas's personal cell, the number Margaret had quietly passed along without making a thing of it. Thomas saw the unfamiliar area code, answered anyway, and heard a voice that was careful and slower than he'd expected. Measured, like someone who had learned to think before speaking and was still getting used to the discipline of it. "Sergeant Hale," the voice said. "This is Daniel. I was hoping we could talk." They met at Portman's Diner on the edge of town, a place Thomas had chosen deliberately, public enough to be neutral, quiet enough for an honest conversation. Daniel was already there when Thomas arrived. He was thinner than the photos Thomas had seen, with the particular stillness of someone who had recently stopped running from something and hadn't yet figured out what to do with the quiet. He stood when Thomas approached the table. They shook hands. They ordered coffee. Neither of them touched it right away. Daniel didn't make excuses. He didn't explain or justify or ask for understanding. He simply said that he had lost time, a lot of it, and that he was trying to find his way back to something worth returning to. "I'm not asking to walk back in," he said. "I know that's not how it works." "No," Thomas said. "It's not. I just need to know they're okay." He looked down at his cup. "Harper especially. She carried too much even before. She still does," Thomas said. Daniel nodded slowly. The admission landed on him visibly. Lily draws pictures of you, Thomas said after a moment. She still puts you in them. Even now. Daniel looked up. He didn't speak, but something moved across his face. Not relief, not joy. Something quieter and more complicated. The expression of a man confronting, without flinching, exactly what he had almost lost. His hands, wrapped around the coffee cup, were steadier than Thomas had expected. That steadiness told Thomas more than anything Daniel could have said. They talked for 40 minutes. When Thomas stood to leave, Daniel stood too. "Thank you," Daniel said, "for being there." Thomas looked at him for a moment. "Show up for them," he said. "That's all I'm doing. That's all any of us can do." He drove back to Millhaven slowly, the morning quiet around him. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't resolution. But it was a beginning. Fragile, honest, and real. Sometimes Thomas had learned that was exactly enough. The school sent home a notice on a Friday. Family heritage presentation. Each student would share something about their family. A photo, an object, a story. 2 minutes in front of the class. The following Thursday. Harper read the notice once, folded it, and put it in her notebook without comment. Thomas found out 3 days later. Not from Harper, but from Lily, who mentioned it the way Lily mentioned most things. Casually, completely, while eating an apple at the kitchen table. "Harper doesn't have a picture with everyone in it," Lily said. "I checked the album." That evening, Thomas found Harper on the back steps. He sat beside her without being invited. The cold had settled early, the kind that comes before a long winter rather than after one. The yard was quiet. A neighbor's porch light flickered twice and steadied. "You don't have to do the presentation," he said. "Yes, I do," she said. "Okay," he said. They sat in silence for a moment. "Will you come?" she asked, not looking at him. Her voice even, careful, the way it always was when she was asking for something she wasn't sure she deserved. "Not as anything official. Just to be there. I'll be there," he said. He sat in the back of the classroom on Thursday morning, still in his jacket, badge off. The room smelled like crayons, and the particular warmth of too many small bodies in one space. Other parents and grandparents sat in folding chairs along the wall. Thomas took a spot near the door. When Harper's turn came, she walked to the front without rushing. She didn't bring a photograph. She brought her notebook. She opened it, looked at the class, and then closed it again, as if she'd decided at the last moment not to read from it. "My family is complicated," she said. Her voice was steady. "My grandmother raised us when she didn't have to. My dad is working on coming back. And there are people who showed up, who just decided to stay. And that taught me something." She paused. "It taught me that trying is what love actually looks like." The room was quiet in a way that rooms rarely get quiet. Thomas looked at the floor. In the hallway afterward, Harper fell into step beside him without ceremony. They walked toward the exit. Then she stopped. "I thought you were going to cry," she said. "I wasn't," he said. "You totally were." And then she smiled, fully, without reservation, without the careful guardedness she'd worn since the first day in the church pew. Thomas laughed quietly. Then she asked, looking at her shoes, her voice dropping just slightly, "If my dad doesn't make it, are you going to leave too?" The hallway was empty around them. Thomas looked at this girl who kept lists and cried facing away, and served everyone before herself. "No," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She nodded once. Then she walked ahead of him toward the exit, shoulders straight. But just before she pushed through the door, she held it open, waiting for him to catch up. He did. The call came on a Wednesday evening. Margaret had been quieter than usual for 2 days. Thomas had noticed, but said nothing, not wanting to alarm the girls. He'd mentioned it to the county nurse during her Thursday check-in. She'd said she would follow up. She didn't get the chance. At 6:47, Margaret sat down in her chair by the window and didn't get back up. She was conscious. She wasn't in pain, but her blood pressure had dropped and her hands wouldn't stop trembling. And when Lily brought her a glass of water, Margaret looked at it for a long moment as if she'd forgotten what it was for. Harper called Thomas first, then the nurse line. Thomas arrived before the ambulance. He found Harper standing in the center of the living room with her arms at her sides, very still, in the particular way she got still when she was holding everything together through sheer concentration. Lily was beside her grandmother, holding her hand, talking to her softly about nothing, about school, about the elephant project, about a bird she'd seen that morning, keeping her grandmother present with the only tools she had. Thomas knelt beside Margaret. "I'm here," he said quietly. "Help is coming." Margaret looked at him. "The girls," she said. "I know," he said. "I've got them." The hospital waiting room was the same one Thomas had sat in weeks before. Same fluorescent lights. Same vending machine in the corner with the crooked selection panel. Same smell of clean floors and recycled air. The girls sat beside him, Lily pressed against his arm, Harper upright in her chair, staring at the middle distance. Brenda Solis arrived at 8:15, Patricia Wynne 20 minutes after. They spoke to Thomas in the corridor, quietly and directly. Margaret would need at least 2 weeks of inpatient care, possibly more. The supervised extension was under review. If a permanent placement couldn't be confirmed, county protocol required transfer to a licensed arrangement. In Carlton, 40 miles away. Thomas kept his voice steady. "Give me tonight," he said. Brenda looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at Thomas. "Tomorrow morning," Patricia said. "We need something on paper." Nora arrived at 10. She didn't ask questions when he called. She just said, "I'm on my way." After the girls were settled, Lily asleep across 2 waiting room chairs, Harper pretending to sleep, Thomas and Nora sat at the kitchen table back at Clover Street. The house felt different, empty, larger, colder. What neither of them knew was that Harper was awake. She had asked to use the bathroom 20 minutes ago and never come back downstairs. She sat at the top of the staircase in the dark, her knees pulled to her chest, listening. And in the bedroom, on her bed, Lily's small backpack sat packed by the door, just in case. Thomas told Nora everything about the review, about Carlton, about what separation would mean for 2 girls who had already lost so much of what held them together. Nora listened without interrupting. Then she said, "I can take them, Dad. Temporarily, if you're really there this time." The kitchen was very quiet. Thomas looked at his daughter across the table. This woman he had loved imperfectly and from too great a distance for too many years. He reached across the table. He took her hand. He hadn't done that since she was small enough to need help crossing the street. "I'll be there," he said. "I promise." Upstairs, Harper heard every word. She sat in the dark for a long moment. Then she stood, walked back to the bedroom, picked up Lily's backpack, and quietly put it away. The paperwork took 4 days. Thomas had expected bureaucracy. He'd worked alongside it for 20 years, and understood that systems moved at their own pace regardless of what was urgent on the human side of the desk. He didn't fight it. He gathered what was needed, made the calls, and showed up in person wherever showing up in person moved things faster. Nora handled the legal language. She was methodical and precise, and had her father's instinct for knowing which details mattered. Together they filed a joint temporary guardianship request, supported by Margaret's written consent, signed from her hospital bed with a hand that trembled slightly but held the pen firmly, Patricia Wynne's formal recommendation, and Brenda's complete case documentation. It wasn't adoption. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was 2 people building something real out of available materials, without pretending the materials were more than they were. Thomas submitted his early retirement papers on a Thursday morning. He sat across from Captain Briggs, who read the form twice before looking up. "You sure?" Briggs said. "Yes," Thomas said. Briggs studied him for a long moment, the way people study someone they've known for a long time, when they're trying to reconcile who that person was with who they're becoming. Then he extended his hand. "You were a good officer, Thomas," he said. "I'm trying to be a better man," Thomas said. Briggs nodded once. That was enough. Daniel was included in the plan, not at the center of it, not yet, but present in it, which was its own kind of progress. A structured visitation schedule, supervised and gradual, designed by Patricia with input from a family counselor. No pressure, no performance, just consistent, quiet presence, the only currency that actually meant anything at this point. Daniel agreed to every condition without negotiation. That told Thomas what he needed to know. Margaret was transferred to Cloverfield Rehabilitation and Extended Care on a Friday afternoon. Thomas drove her himself. The facility was clean and calm, with wide windows that let in good light, and a common room where several residents sat playing cards near a real fireplace. Margaret assessed it with her particular combination of dignity and practicality, asked 3 specific questions of the admissions nurse, and declared it acceptable. Thomas carried her bag. The girls visited that Sunday. Harper brought the notebook. She read Margaret the week's schedule, school days, visit days, phone call days, in her small, precise voice while Margaret listened with her eyes closed and a faint smile. Lily brought a drawing. In it, a woman sat in a chair by a window with light coming through. Labeled in careful letters, Grandma, in her good chair. Margaret held it for a long time. Then she took Harper's hand. "I never wanted to be a burden," she said quietly. Harper looked at her grandmother without hesitation. "You're not a burden, Grandma," she said. "You're the reason we know how to hold on." Thomas stood in the doorway. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. For the first time in 20 years of showing up to other people's worst moments in an official capacity, with a badge, a radio, a procedure to follow, he was simply a man standing in a doorway. Imperfect. Late to many things. But present. Fully, finally, without reservation. Present. Chapter 15. What Staying Looks Like. 6 months later, the table in Nora's house was too small for everyone. Thomas discovered this at 4:30 in the afternoon, when he was setting up and realized that even with the leaf inserted, there weren't enough chairs for 6 people and a tablet propped against the fruit bowl. He went to the garage and brought out 2 folding chairs, the old ones with the slightly uneven legs, and arranged them without ceremony at the ends. Lily supervised. She had appointed herself official table setter and took the responsibility with great seriousness. Forks on the left, knives on the right, napkins folded once, glasses at the upper right corner of each plate, exactly the way Margaret had taught her. "Grandma says the table tells people they're expected," Lily announced to no one in particular. "She's right," Nora said from the kitchen. Harper was in there too, standing beside Nora at the counter, explaining that Margaret always added a little lemon to the green beans. Not a lot, just enough. "How much is enough?" Nora asked. Harper considered this seriously. "You'll know," she said. Daniel arrived early. He knocked, didn't walk in, knocked. And when Thomas opened the door, Daniel was standing on the porch with a small bunch of grocery store flowers held in both hands, the kind wrapped in plastic with a paper bow, the most honest kind. "Is this okay?" Daniel asked. "Meaning the flowers, meaning the visit, meaning all of it." "Come in," Thomas said. Daniel stepped inside quietly. He said hello to Nora. He hugged Lily, who grabbed him around the middle and didn't let go for a long moment. He looked at Harper. Harper looked back at him. Then she said, "There's lemon in the green beans." "I love lemon," he said. She nodded once and went back to the kitchen. It wasn't forgiveness completed. It was forgiveness in motion. Slow, honest, taking one quiet step at a time. Daniel didn't sit at the head of the table. He sat where Lily pointed, between her and the empty chair they'd left close to the tablet. At 6 o'clock, Nora propped the tablet against the fruit bowl and called the facility. Margaret appeared on the screen, her silver hair brushed, her good cardigan on, sitting straight in a chair by a window with real evening light behind her. She looked at the crowded table and pressed one hand briefly to her mouth. "There aren't enough chairs," she said. "We got extra ones," Lily said. "From the garage." "Good," Margaret said. "That's exactly right." Halfway through dinner, the call dropped. Everyone stopped. Then it came back. Margaret mid-sentence not missing a beat. Nobody panicked. Nobody made it dramatic. They just waited. Because that was something they had learned. All of them together. Over the longest and most important months of their lives. How to wait. How to hold on. How to trust that what mattered would come back. Thomas sat at the far end of the table. He looked at all of it. The noise, the mismatched chairs, the lemon in the green beans. Daniel's grocery store flowers in a glass of water because nobody could find a vase. Margaret's voice coming through a tablet propped against a fruit bowl. Harper correcting someone's grammar. Lily explaining the proper placement of forks to a father who was learning, again, how to be present. Imperfect. Loud. Overflowing. Real. Lily climbed into the chair beside him without asking. She picked up her fork and started eating with the focused contentment of a child who is exactly where she belongs. Thomas laughed, quietly to himself. He had spent 20 years protecting a town that mostly moved on without him. He had followed procedures and filed reports and shown up to moments that weren't his, and left before they could become his. He had thought retirement would feel like an ending. Instead, it felt like arrival. Not at a destination he had planned or applied for or earned through the correct channels, but at one that had been waiting, patiently, quietly, in a church pew on a Sunday afternoon, for him to finally stop and stay. He picked up his fork. The table was too small and too loud and exactly right. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love or something you've carried, or a moment when someone chose to stay, leave a comment below. Those are the stories that matter most, and so are you.